Okay, you've given me a stack of articles about how different cultures view time and deadlines, but then you threw in an episode of a business English podcast, and now I'm really interested. Is this about more than just like knowing when to show up for a meeting in Tokyo?
What's fascinating is that we think of time as this universal constant, but the truth is it's a language all its own with different dialects and accents depending on where you are in the world. And just like miscommunication can lead to confusion in any language, misinterpreting time speak can lead to major problems in international business.
So this deep dive is like a crash course in cultural fluency when it comes to time, right?
Exactly. And lucky for you, we've got some incredible stories in these sources that illustrate just how crucial this is.
Okay, so this Business English podcast episode, Time and Deadline Negotiations, Cultural Perspectives, jumps right in with this story about a project manager in New York who almost caused a major soon-pocalypse. What's the takeaway here?
This story, it highlights how seemingly simple words like soon can have drastically different interpretations depending on the cultural context. The project manager's casual "let's wrap this up soon" email sent her team in Tokyo scrambling to finish within the hour, while her Mumbai colleagues assumed they had until next week.
And her Swedish team.
Yeah, they were just left scratching their heads.
So soon is like a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate intercultural chaos.
You could say that. It's a classic example of how a lack of clarity around time can derail projects and damage relationships. What's interesting is that the podcast episode analyzes the soon-pocalypse as a symptom of a larger problem, the assumption that everyone perceives time in the same way.
I'm starting to see how this goes beyond just being punctual. It's about understanding the underlying values and assumptions different cultures have about time itself.
Exactly. And the episode doesn't stop there. It introduces a concept they call the cultural calendar matrix, a tool to help you visualize how different cultures approach scheduling, deadlines, and the overall flow of work.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. What exactly is this cultural calendar matrix and how does it work?
Imagine a grid, okay? One axis represents the level of formality in a culture's approach to time. Think rigid schedules versus fluid adaptability. The other axis represents their orientation towards the past, present, or future. By plotting different cultures on this matrix, you can start to see how their values influence their time speak.
So if I'm working with a team in Germany known for their precision and adherence to schedules, they'd be somewhere on the formal end of the spectrum, right?
You got it. They'd likely be on the formal and future-oriented side, valuing punctuality and sticking to deadlines. But a team in Spain might be more on the informal and present-oriented side, prioritizing relationships and flexibility over rigid schedules.
That makes sense. And knowing this helps me anticipate potential challenges and adjust my communication accordingly, right?
Exactly. The cultural calendar matrix gives you a framework for understanding where those time dialect differences might arise and how to bridge the gap.
This is already giving me a whole new perspective on how to approach international projects. It's not just about managing tasks, it's about managing expectations and understanding the cultural context behind those expectations.
Precisely. And the podcast episode goes on to give practical advice on how to use this matrix to avoid misunderstandings and streamline collaboration. For example, if you're working with a culture that's more present-oriented, you might want to break down projects into smaller, more manageable chunks and celebrate milestones along the way. This can help keep everyone engaged and motivated, even if the long-term deadline feels less concrete to them.
That's a great tip. I'm also curious about the time zone issue. The podcast mentioned something called the Great Timeline Tangle of 2024. What was that all about?
The Great Timeline Tangle is a cautionary tale about the importance of clear communication when it comes to time zones. The podcast gives an example of a global product launch where the team in New York was celebrating hitting a deadline, while their colleagues in Singapore were pulling an all-nighter thinking they were behind schedule.
Ouch, that sounds stressful, all because of a simple time zone miscommunication.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of specifying time zones whenever you're setting deadlines or scheduling meetings across multiple locations.
I'm definitely going to be more mindful of that from now on. I'm starting to see how these seemingly small details can have a huge impact on the success of a project.
Absolutely. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The podcast episode dives deeper into the nuances of cultural time perception, exploring how different cultures view punctuality, meeting etiquette, and even the concept of time itself.
Well, you've definitely hooked me. I'm ready to explore the depths of this time-speak ocean. What else is in store for us in this deep dive?
In the next part, we'll delve into the specific language of time, exploring how different cultures use temporal expressions like soon and later, and what those expressions really mean. We'll unpack more fascinating anecdotes and practical strategies for bridging the gap between different cultural approaches to time.
This is already so much more than I expected. I can't wait to hear more. We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive into cultural time management. Stay tuned. Okay, we're back, ready to decode more of this time speak.
So we've established that time is not this universal language, but more like a tapestry woven with all these different cultural threads. What are some common pitfalls when it comes to the language of deadlines and scheduling across cultures?
Well, this Business English podcast, it really nails it with a section they call The Hidden Meanings in Deadline Discussions. It explores how what's said and what's meant can be totally different depending on the culture.
So reading between the lines when it comes to deadlines.
Exactly. For instance, they give an example of a German colleague saying the deadline is tight. In their culture, that's probably a genuine expression of concern, straightforward,
Yeah.
But if an Israeli team says the same thing, it might actually be signaling the start of a negotiation, like an invitation to push back or propose alternatives. So the same phrase can be like a warning flag in one culture and a starting pistol for negotiation in another. That's a big difference.
It is. And it highlights how important it is to understand the cultural subtext. The podcast also points out that some cultures are way more comfortable with ambiguity around deadlines than others.
Right.
Like the phrase, "we'll get back to you soon,"
Yeah.
could mean anything from tomorrow to sometime next month, depending on where you are in the world.
I guess that's where that soon apocalypse we talked about could really, come into play.
Exactly. And the podcast offers some really insightful advice on navigating this kind of ambiguity.
Okay.
One suggestion was to embrace the time expectation alignment technique. It's all about being proactive, clarifying things up front. Instead of assuming you're on the same page, take the time to define what key terms like soon, urgent, flexible actually mean to each person involved.
So it's like setting the ground rules for time speak before the game even begins.
Exactly. Aligning expectations up front can avoid a lot of frustration and miscommunication later on.
Makes sense. Speaking of avoiding frustration, the podcast had a whole section on meeting mayhem. I'm guessing that's about cultural differences around meeting etiquette, right?
You got it. This section dives into the nuances of punctuality, meeting flow, and decision-making styles.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in some cultures like Germany or Japan, meetings are supposed to start and end on time.
Right.
With a clear agenda, focus on efficiency.
Yeah. Whereas in other cultures, things might be a little more, relaxed.
Exactly. In Latin American or Mediterranean cultures, for instance, a little bit of socializing before getting down to business is kind of expected. And time might be viewed as more fluid, with interruptions and tangents, just part of the natural flow.
So what happens when these different meeting styles collide? I imagine it could lead to some awkward moments.
It definitely can. The podcast gave an example of a Swedish team. They're used to their efficient fika breaks, being completely thrown off by their Brazilian colleagues' extended lunch meetings that just kind of blended into the afternoon. The Swedes felt like time was being wasted, while the Brazilians felt rushed and undervalued.
It's a classic case of time-speak miscommunication.
Mm.
So how do you bridge that gap between these different approaches? Do you just have to, adapt to the dominant culture?
Not necessarily. The podcast suggests a more collaborative approach.
Yeah.
They highlighted this Finnish-Korean joint venture that had a brilliant solution. They recognized the differences in their meeting styles, so they created what they call timeline tempo.
Okay, what is timeline tempo and how does it work?
Basically, they built in different tempos within their meetings. They'd start with relationship building slow time, where informal conversation and personal connections were the priority. Then they'd shift to action-oriented fast time for decision-making and problem-solving, using a more structured approach. Finally, they'd go back to slow time to make sure everyone felt heard and to solidify consensus.
It's like a choreographed dance between these different time rhythms.
That's a great way to put it. And the results were impressive. This timeline tempo not only created a more respectful and inclusive meeting environment, but it also led to more creative solutions and stronger buy-in from both sides.
It's a great example of how acknowledging and adapting to cultural differences can just lead to better collaboration. It sounds like we've just scratched the surface of this topic. What else is there as we continue this deep dive?
Well, in the final part, we're going to go beyond deadlines and meetings. We'll explore the philosophical underpinnings of how different cultures perceive time itself. We'll unpack concepts like linear versus cyclical time, monochronic versus polychronic cultures, and the fascinating interplay between cultural values and temporal experience.
I'm already feeling my mind expanding. Bring on part 3. Okay, we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into cultural time management. We have explored the language of deadlines, like decoded the hidden meanings in scheduling across cultures, and even learned a new dance move.
The timeline tempo.
Yeah. Now, let's explore how different cultures perceive the very concept of time itself.
This is where things get really interesting. We often take our perception of time for granted, assuming it's like universal. But the truth is, time is a cultural construct. It's shaped by our values, our beliefs, our historical experiences.
So it's not just about being on time or meeting deadlines, it's like about how we fundamentally experience time itself.
Exactly. The way we think about the past, present, and future, the pace at which we live our lives, even the importance we place on schedules versus spontaneity.
Yeah.
All of this is influenced by our cultural background.
This reminds me of that cultural calendar matrix we talked about earlier.
Right.
How some cultures are more future-oriented while others prioritize the present moment.
That's a great connection. The cultural calendar matrix is really useful for understanding these broader cultural differences in time perception. For example, cultures that are more past-oriented, like many indigenous cultures, tend to value tradition,
Yeah.
ancestral wisdom, a cyclical view of time.
Where the past, present, and future are all kind of interconnected.
Exactly. Time is seen as a continuous flow, where the past informs the present and the present shapes the future. Decisions are made with a long-term perspective, considering the impact on future generations.
That's so different from like the linear future-focused perspective that's dominant in a lot of Western cultures.
It is, and it can lead to really different approaches to business and decision-making. For instance, the podcast episode highlighted the Japanese concept of nimawashi.
Oh, yeah, I remember you mentioning that. Could you remind me what that means again?
Nimawashi. It's the process of informally building consensus before making any major decisions. It involves consulting with all the stakeholders, gathering feedback, addressing concerns before anything is, formally proposed.
So it's a very thorough, deliberate process.
It is. And it can take time, but in Japanese culture, it's seen as an essential investment in long-term success. By ensuring that everyone's on board from the start, you avoid potential conflicts and create a stronger foundation for implementation.
It makes a lot of sense. It's a great example of how a culture's time perspective can shape their whole approach to business and leadership.
And it's not just about long-term planning. Cultural time perception also influences, the pace of life, how people approach work-life balance.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that when I travel. Some cultures just seem to operate at a much faster pace than others.
You're right. This is where the concepts of monochronic and polychronic cultures come into play. Monochronic cultures, like the US or Germany, tend to value efficiency, punctuality, a linear approach to time. They focus on one task at a time and compartmentalize their work and personal lives.
Okay.
Whereas polychronic cultures are more comfortable with multitasking, more fluidity.
Right.
In polychronic cultures, like many Latin American or Mediterranean cultures, relationships and flexibility are prioritized. They might be more comfortable juggling multiple tasks, interruptions are just seen as part of life, and personal connections are kind of woven into the workday.
So a monochronic culture might see a polychronic culture as disorganized or chaotic, while a polychronic culture might see a monochronic culture as rigid or impersonal.
That's a great way to put it. It's not that one approach is better than the other, they're just different.
Yeah.
And the key is to understand these differences and adapt your communication and collaboration style accordingly.
This has been such an eye-opening look at cultural time management. It's made me realize how much we take our own time perspective for granted and how crucial it is to be aware of these cultural nuances, especially when you're working across borders.
I'm glad to hear that. Remember, time is not just a tool for measuring productivity. It's a reflection of our values and a key to understanding different cultural perspectives. By embracing this understanding, we can build stronger relationships, navigate those intercultural challenges more effectively, and ultimately create a more harmonious and productive global workplace.
Well said. Thanks for taking us on this fascinating journey through the world of cultural time management.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all of you listening out there, remember, time is what we make it, so let's make the most of it together.
See you next time for another deep dive.